Hello everyone, and how's it going? Today I'm bringing some of the fighting game research I've been doing on how playstyle, practice hours, and performance affect one another among Super Smash Bros. Melee players. Just as a preface, I got inspiration for this project from the YouTube channel Core A Gaming and his video on Laughs Theory. So if you're into really well thought out and articulate videos on fighting games, or if you even just want a little bit more information on the theory that this study was based on, I really recommend you go check it out, and I've put a link to his channel in our description. So now, before we dive into the nitty-gritty of the study, I want to give a quick overview of what will be discussed. First, I'm going to explain Laughs Theory, and then go into how I chose to measure the three play styles outlined in that theory. After my measurement model is established, I'll go into discussing the analyses and results of the study as well. So Laughs Theory posits that there are three types of fighting game players. Basically, this old Street Fighter pro, Laugh, said that there was the brains, the heart, and the body. So brains players, they prefer to outthink and out-strategize their opponents, and really spend a lot of time labbing and practicing different ways to counter and optimally punish certain strategies their opponents will perform. Whereas the heart player plays a lot on intuition and playing mind games with their opponent, or really just trying to catch them off guard with their unpredictable and volatile playstyle. And lastly, the body. They play technical characters and focus on executing difficult combos and techniques in order to win their games. So how did I go about measuring these three play styles? First, I developed 9 items for each of these constructs. So a total of 27 items, with 9 items in the brain category, 9 items in the heart category, and 9 items in the body category. An example of a brain item would be frame data is important to know in order to win. For heart, I had an item that said, I like to play mind games with my opponent. And lastly, for the body, I rarely make mistakes in my execution of techniques and combos. So for each of these items, there was a 7-point Likert scale for each of the participants to respond to. So for these items, each participant was asked to rate on a 7-point Likert scale how strongly they either agreed or disagreed with the item. So for strongly agree, they were given 3 points, and for strongly disagree, they were given -3 points. What this means is that the responses were summed to get a score for each construct, with higher scores, more positive scores, indicating a stronger tendency towards that playstyle. So if I got a 20 for body, then it indicates that I really heavily value being a technical player, and that even it could indicate that my execution tends to be stronger. Whereas if I got a -20, it would indicate the opposite. Now for the analyses, I used a method called structural equation modeling. This is a multivariate statistical analysis technique that is used to analyze structural relationships. So essentially, if there was a big web involving playstyle, practice hours, and performance, the structure and the relationships between them are what we're analyzing. The benefit of using this statistical analysis technique is it actually allows me to test the validity of my scale and remove items that are problematic. One example of a problematic item would be an item that describes multiple of the constructs. So let's say somebody who scored high on brain, or all of the people who scored high on brain, also scored high on a specific heart item. That would be a problematic item because it shows that it might actually be measuring brain more so than heart. You can actually run into the other problem though, which is that among all the people who scored highly in brain, they did not answer strongly for this particular item. That would be another problematic item. In addition to testing my measurement model, this allows me to model the effects of playstyle on practice time and peak performance. So again, this was kind of the whole idea of the study, was to see how does playstyle affect performance in practice time, and in what ways. Lastly, I wanted to examine if there are differences between melee-only players and those who play at least one other fighting game. I wanted to look into this because there is a lot of discussion on where Smash and Melee fall within the fighting game community, whether they're actually fighting games, and I thought this would be an interesting way to see if the players play differently or if it has different effects on their performance. It's not necessarily going to conclude whether, Smash is a fighting game or whether these types of players are exactly the same, but it'll at least provide a little bit of insight on whether their playstyle interacts with performance and practice time in the same ways as other fighting game players. And here's a little diagram to kind of help outline what we're looking at here. Again, we get to see how all the constructs interact with each other on top of how these constructs interact with our variables of practice time and peak performance. So as with all studies, there was some preliminary data cleaning we had to do. In terms of the normality assumptions, peak performance and practice hours were positively skewed. That's kind of expected because if you look at just kind of the distribution of players, you're going to have mostly average or below average players and very few top players. So those who place really high at tournaments and practice a lot are going to be fewer and further between. However, despite this skew, the QQ plots, skewness, and kurtosis, which are all measures of normality, were still within acceptable ranges for our analyses. All playstyle items were approximately normal, so we were good there. We didn't have to do any sort of log transformations or power transformations for any of our variables, which was nice. What we did have to do was address outliers, and there were a few. Practice hours. Again, we kind of went over this with how our distribution was, in that there were a few players who practiced way more or performed better than other players, but that they were not the typical players. So what we ended up having to do was Winsorize these values, which, for those of you who aren't familiar with the term Winsorizing, let's say that, or in this case, the next lowest value below 35 was 30. So you would take our several participants who were at 35 and then our other participants who were at 40 hours per week, and you would set them at 31 and 32 accordingly. This allows us to really conduct these analyses a little bit better, because the way these analyses work is they don't really like when the data doesn't fit a certain distribution, and we still keep the overall shape and trend of our data with these transformations, as it's not that dramatic. And we had to do the same thing with a few of the items as well, even though they were normally distributed. When we did the box plots, it showed a few outliers, in particularly brain item number 9. Strongly disagree was considered an outlier, and this is in part because the item is I enjoy studying the game. That among competitive players, that's probably common for all of them, regardless of playstyle. If you care enough to get better at the game, you're likely going to care enough to study the game to an extent. So this might not be a brains only item, and that's why I strongly disagree was more of an outlier. Heart probably had the most outliers of any of the constructs. We had items 2, 3, and 5 that we had to Winsorize from strongly disagree to disagree. Essentially, the heart items 2, my favorite way to practice is by learning the flow of the game. Again, this is probably something that people just don't feel that strongly about. They might disagree, but they're not going to say, well, I hate learning the flow of the game. They're just going to say, hey, maybe it's not my cup of tea. I'd rather sit there and grind tech skill or lab out some punishes. Part item number 3, I like to play mind games with my opponent. Again, this might be something that just applies to everyone, where to a certain extent, people don't really hate to play mind games with their opponent. They might disagree with it. They might not like to do it as their best way of winning, but they ultimately don't feel as strongly about it. And then again, heart item number 5, I will try to predict my opponent, even if it's not optimal for me to do so. This might be one of those things where heart item number 5, I will try to predict my opponent, even if it's not optimal for me to do so. This one, it's tricky because I think this is very indicative of a heart player, but it could just be that people broadly just don't hate doing that. It's everybody loves a nice flashy hard read. You have the Mango up smash read on Hungrybox, and lots of other reads out there that people lose their minds over, reverse falcon punches, things like that. It's exciting. People like to do it even if it's not optimal. A better way to phrase this question would be to say, in order to win, I like to predict my opponent. And then body item number 5, we had to Winsorize from strongly agree to agree. this item was, I rarely make mistakes in my execution of techniques and combos. Looks like our melee subreddit is filled with a bunch of humble players. Everyone here is thinking, well, I might rarely make some mistakes in my execution of techniques and combos, but I don't feel so good about myself that I would say strongly agree. I don't have any data to support this, but it seems like that might be the case in terms of the way the data showed up. The measurement model. This is kind of a little bit more of the nitty gritty of, did my scale for measuring playstyle hold up based on the model fit? It ended up being, to improve the fit of the model, some of the items were removed. For example, brain items 3 and 8 were both removed. Number 3, there's always a correct answer to my opponent's strategy. And number 8, I'm very uncomfortable when an opponent puts me in an unfamiliar situation. I think that these ended up not being very good in the model because everyone might feel that way. It could have been the way I phrased the question, right? Like, there's always a correct answer to my opponent's strategy. There might not always be a correct answer, but I think if I had phrased it, in order to win, I have to find the correct answer to my opponent's strategy, that might have mapped onto brain more effectively. And uncomfortable situation might have been a form of me accidentally priming my participants by saying uncomfortable and unfamiliar, they go together. It's likely it could have been by the way I asked this question. So because it's not the best question for both of these and it affected the model fit negatively, we took them out of the model. For heart, I thrive in high pressure situations. This can be one that again applies to most of the constructs. A body player will say, oh, my tech skill doesn't go down in high pressure situations. A brains player might say, oh, in high pressure situations, I've thought about these situations before and I can handle them. So again, not the best item. We're removing it, especially because of the way it affected model fit. Lastly, we removed body item number 3, which is I prefer to react to my opponent rather than predict my opponent. This one could be an issue of phrasing. It could be an issue of being applicable to everyone. I think that someone could read this question is that you're reacting to what your opponent is currently doing and not necessarily emphasizing the fact that it's a quick reaction. Again, this was my first attempt at this scale, so there was bound to be some problematic items, and I think only removing 4 out of the 27 items was pretty successful. And for those of you who might be worried about brain having fewer items, the way that the analyses are run, it doesn't matter. If brain ends up being consistently higher than heart and body, that's not as much of an issue as if when brain is high, heart is high, right? And so it's all kind of relative, and it's not necessarily based on the absolute values of the numbers being high. Now on to the results. So this chart here, it's showing all the significant pathways between all of our constructs and variables. So the basics of what these numbers mean is that for every 1 unit increase in the independent variable, we expect X amount of change in the dependent variable, where X is the number on the line. So let's use brain and practice time. So for every 1 point increase in brain, we see a 1.322 increase in weekly practice hours for the average player. So that means when heart is 0 and body is 0. So using this information, we can see that both brain and body have significant effects on your practice time. So those types of players tend to practice more than heart players. Other interesting pathways are between brain and heart. As you can see, if you're a brain player, you are less likely to be a heart player, whereas the link between body and brain is positive. So if you're a brain player, you're more likely to be a body player than if you weren't a brain player. Now, for some of the more juicy information, let's look at practice on peak performance. So in this case, with practice, for every one hour increase in practice time per week, you see a negative 0.006 effect on performance. Now you might ask, wait, why is it going down? You would think with more practice, you would have greater performance. Well, this happens to be because of the way I coded performance. I took the best placing that an individual had at their tournament and then divided it by the number of entrants in that tournament. So if you placed first out of 100, you would be 0.01. If you placed second, 0.02. Using this information, we kind of extrapolate. If you're the average player, so a player who was 0 on body, 0 on heart, and 0 on brain, increased their practice hours per week by 10 hours, you would see a 6% improvement in peak performance. Now for more fun findings and notes. First of all, there were no differences between individuals who play only Melee and those who play other fighting games. This was determined using the multi-group analysis in my structural equation modeling, which basically said that the model for Melee only players and the model for those who play other fighting games, they weren't significantly different from each other. Additionally, there were no significant effects of playstyle on peak performance in either the model that I studied, or I actually did a model previously where we took this side only, and instead of practice, it was peak performance, and there was no significant arrows. So it doesn't really matter what playstyle you have. It doesn't really affect performance significantly. However, there are indirect effects of your playstyle on peak performance. And what I mean by that is, if you look, well, brain increases your practice hours, and practice hours improves your performance. Same with body. So this means that there is an indirect pathway from brain to peak performance. So in the case for brain playstyle on performance, the indirect effects were a 0.008 improvement, while body players was a 0.011 improvement. This kind of suggests that there might be an effect where brain players are not getting as much out of their practice as body players, which I thought was really interesting, because you would think that it would be roughly comparable, but it's possible that because tech skill is a more tangible thing to grasp, it's easier to see, oh, I'm really landing all my multi-shines and shine grabs and shield drops like 100% of the time. Whereas it's not as easy to see, oh, I'm punishing dash back grab 100% of the time. It's a little more abstract. So it could just be, and it's not a huge difference, but I thought it was worth noting. Some of the interesting descriptive statistics, the average weekly practice time for Melee players was 8.42 hours a week, with a standard deviation of 7.25. And take this with a grain of salt, though, because, again, the data was skewed positively by a few of the, really high outliers. So the median might be a little bit of a better indicator of what a typical Melee player plays per week. But I thought 8.5 hours a week was a pretty good estimate. As for the average peak performance of the participants in this survey, it was around the 32nd percentile. So as for the average peak performance, participants were placing in roughly the 32nd percentile as the mean. But again, this is skewed by a few top players who place really, really highly at tournaments, kind of skewing the data, and from the majority of us who go 0-2 or 1-2 at our tournaments. Obviously, with research comes several limitations. No research is perfect, but for me, a couple of the issues I ran into. One, I was only looking at competitive players, and as part of my survey, I asked if you have competed in a tournament in the last 6 months. So even though I had roughly 800 participants, only 400 of those participants had competed in a tournament in the past 6 months. As much as I'd love to keep everyone, I think current tournament players was a good limitation. Maybe I should have said in the past 12 months, but I think past 6 months is a good indicator of the type of player you are. So even though a sample size of 400 was more than enough, it would have been nice to include everyone or just be more inclusive, because at the moment, I haven't been to a tournament in over 6 months. School has been kicking my butt, but I would still consider myself a competitive Melee player. So, maybe in the future, if I ever do this study again, maybe make that a little bit less strict, or, set it up to be a year or 2 years. Lastly, and I think this was the most impactful error or limitation in the study, is that because almost all Smash tournaments are double elimination, it's really challenging to code performance, right? So for everyone who was 0-2, for everyone who just went to the tournament, lost both immediately, I coded them as getting last place or being in the 100th percentile. This ends up kind of heavily weighting the distribution towards the bottom, but I didn't really have another reasonable way to do this. I could have gone and made brackets for every single every single tournament size listed, and then set up everyone as tying for XYZ place. But it just seems to be the most reasonable way to code performance in this case. I did actually go through and make fake brackets for a lot of the 1-2s and 2-2s that people would put into the survey, which was a mistake on my part, because I should have made the survey so that people could only put in just regular numbers and no symbols, and then I think I would have gotten slightly better information. Because I think if you do go 0-2, people would be willing to say, oh, I got 25th out of 25 at my local, versus me trying to figure out, what is going 1-2 at an 80-person tournament mean in terms of performance. But I did it, and I think it ended up working out. The data ended up being good regardless. Last, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to listen to this video. I really had a lot of fun with this project. Again, I want to say thank you to Core A Gaming I actually reached out to him and asked him if I could talk about him in this video. He said yeah, and kind of gave me some words of encouragement about my project. So thank you, Core A. I love your videos, and I hope that more people check you out. And lastly, I want to thank the Reddit community, in particular the Super Smash Bros. Melee community. You guys were great. I only had a couple of troll responses in the survey that I had to weed out, but it was really fun to work on this project, and you guys came out in overwhelming numbers. Again, I was expecting maybe an 80 or 90 person response, but 800 to 900 was more of the realm that we ended up in. So. Again, if you have any questions, make sure you put it in the comments, or you can feel free to reach out to me by other means. And yeah, if there's any other projects you want to see with me using this data, I actually I got a lot of data on what character mains they had, what other games specifically they played, and worst performances, things like that. There's a lot of interesting data that I gathered in the study, and there's more projects I could do with it. So be on the lookout for more from this specific data set. A lot of cool stats out there in gaming, and I hope to be able to provide you guys with more interesting stuff in the future. Take care.